We continue in Luke 21 today as we complete the first part of Luke's apocalyptic discourse here in 21:5 to 28. We'll continue next time with the parable of the trees, and then we'll get to the closing summary at the end. So as you can see on the right side of the screen, we've been going through Jesus' Jerusalem ministry, and if you haven't watched the introductory video for this whole section of Luke 20 and 21, I encourage you to do so, where I go over some of the methodological issues and also how Luke's using of the tradition from Mark that we see in the synoptic comparisons for the whole unit as we looked at the beginning, follow Luke's particular narration and his particular use of language. So even though much of what he gets is from Mark, it has its own way of being interpreted within the narrative of Luke's gospel. So I go over that in the introductory section. As we've been seeing, this first 5 parts forms the chiasm around the question of authority, and we looked through all of those, and then we saw the intermediate section here around the scribes and the devouring of widows' houses, showing how the scribes engage in the worst possible relationship with Scripture, interpreting it so that the rich can get richer at the expense of the poor. And that leads to the apocalyptic discourse we've seen here. And as I've been going through this, I showed early on this shape of the situation in 21:5 to 36, but as I noted at the time, and that I've been noting in the video since then, there's nothing precise about this. This could be adapted around a couple of different verses here. It's not a chiasm, but I wanted to show the basic parallel between the question and the things that happen before that are not the signs of the telos, of the end, and then the answer to the question here. But as I've been going through these last few sections, you can see from this little unit, it could also be looked at from this perspective, where 12 to 16, which it forms a little chiasm as we saw, anticipates fulfillment of everything named there in Acts. And then 17 to 21, although as you can see on the left side of the screen, I went through 22 last time, but really 17 to 21 intratextually echo what Jesus has said earlier in Luke. So intratextual in the sense of within the Gospel of Luke. And although I included 22 last time, really that's part of this unit that has intertextual echoes, and this was part of the Isaiah 61 reference that was echoed in Luke 4 when he engages in his inaugural sermon in Nazareth, but omitting the last part of Isaiah 61:2, the days of vengeance. So really it's 22 to 28 that are here in these echoes, and I did it with 23 because we already did 22 in the last one, but really we can see that here. And that's an interesting way to shape it, I think, that shows that in Jesus' words we see all kinds of other words fulfilled. What has yet to be narrated in Acts, which Jesus has already said, and the words of prophets and other words in the Bible, especially, and as I've been looking at the religion of creation parts of the Bible, that show that those listening to Jesus ought to understand what's happening because it's all been said before. So let's look here, as you can see on the right side of the screen, at the synoptic comparison, and you can see how different Luke's part is here. The parts that are in crossouts are the parts that Luke has omitted. So this whole section here, all of this, other than this little piece, Luke leaves out, even though Matthew follows it very closely. He has a few other details that you see here, but Luke changes it altogether. So really, we're starting with this section here, and although the warning against being pregnant and nursing is in all of them, as you can see here, all of the rest of this is unique to Luke. And although he also has down here the reference to the human and coming on the cloud, that's from Daniel, and that's certainly central to Mark as well. But then he concludes with an element that's new to him, and then adapts the parable at the end, where he has, as we'll see next time, look at the fig tree and all the trees, whereas Mark started with look at the fig tree and learn its lesson in particular. So we'll really see today how Luke does a unique thing and how he really makes clear for alert readers familiar with the Septuagint version of the Hebrew Bible, how all of what he's saying here ought to be made perfectly clear. As I've been noting too, the sequence in the chapter is out of order because we saw that this part that comes starting in chapter 12 is first. It's before all these things, this will happen. So I put that at the beginning, and now we're down here anticipating the things that are plainly about the Roman siege of Jerusalem and how to understand what's happening there. So I'll put up these intertextual echoes, and we'll go over those as we go through the verses. So starting here in verse 23. And of course, we've seen woes throughout Luke's gospel, and you see a number of times in the Sermon on the Plain there, and I won't belabor that point. This is the penultimate one. It's a common word for Luke to highlight things that are things to be concerned about. But plainly, this is a rhetorical point, because plainly, there's what are pregnant and people nursing going to do? He's simply saying that for these vulnerable people, it's going to be very difficult. And yet, it echoes ironically with this passage from almost the very end of Isaiah, the last chapter of Isaiah, the almost concluding verses. And notice how it's connected with Jerusalem in the opposite way. And for Isaiah, at the end of Isaiah, this is for the post-exilic restoration period. And so it's establishing after the destruction by the Babylonians a new reality, and Luke will have that as well, as in the hope. So rejoice in Jerusalem, that you may nurse and be satisfied from her consoling breasts. So the idea of Jerusalem as the nursing mother there, and the contrast with the woe to human women who are pregnant or nursing in those days. Pregnant here in Gastries contrast with what we saw in the first chapter, the surprising pregnancy of Mary. And there are also references you can see here from Hosea, pregnant and nursing. I didn't put that here because it's really not as directly connected with our scene. And the word for nursing here, thelazonsios, here is one other time in Luke, but we see the reference here that I just put up. And that it continues, for there will be great distress on the earth and wrath against this people. And notice there's a mixture of very specific things. Jerusalem will be trampled by the Gentiles. That's very specific. But then we get to the signs. It's very vague. And this is vague too. What will be the nature of this stress, and what will be the nature of the wrath? Is this a prologue for describing what's here? It could be, but it doesn't have to be that. So the word for distress here, agake, literally means necessity. It can mean distress, and as you can see from the intertextual echo from the psalm, which is a refrain of the psalm, as you see here repeated 3 times, then they cried to Yahweh in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. And one of the questions for the audience here, not like in Mark's situation, where Mark is narrating his story in the midst of the Jewish-Roman War, as Ched Myers has laid out decades ago. Luke is certainly narrating after it, and he's not, and his audience isn't directly concerned, because they're almost certainly young adult Romans who don't really care about Jerusalem, and it's already in the past. But what they might be concerned about here is whether they can trust Jesus to interpret what's going on in their time. And so what we see throughout this unit is people are confused and not knowing what's happening. But if you're paying attention, you should know that you rely on Yahweh to rescue you from your distress and all the other issues that are going on here. And we'll see that as we go. So there'll be great stress on the earth, and you see the earth how many times? Not mentioned where. It doesn't say in Jerusalem in particular, so that could be wider. And wrath against this people. And interestingly, orge for wrath is only one other time when John the Baptist says, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come? And that's the parallels we see here in Matthew 3:7 and Mark 3:5. And not the exact same thing in John 3:36, but it's only there. But in Romans, Paul makes a big point about the wrath of God and what that means for the church in Romans. We, of course, won't get into that now. And it's certainly in the apocalyptic text of Revelation 6 times of the 36 times in the New Testament. But interestingly, it's 303 times in the Septuagint, so many times there. And it can involve all kinds of different things, God's wrath and other wrath. So I focus here on the times where it's associated with people. And you see that here in Exodus, and then this little one from Psalm, which I didn't color properly. I'll fix that before I post it at radicalbible.net. So Moses empowered Yahweh his God and said, O Lord, why does your wrath burn hot against your people, whom you brought out of the land of Egypt with great power and with a mighty hand? And I would note, although this is the story of the golden calf in Exodus 32, we've already seen several references in this section to Moses and Yahweh in chapter 3. We saw the I am statement, many will come in my name and say I am, and don't listen to them. And we also saw that Yahweh will give you a mouth and wisdom that others can't contradict. And we saw in Exodus 4 that Yahweh was with Moses' mouth, as he's with the mouth of the prophets. So this is later in Exodus, but we can see the same question about crying out against God's wrath against the people. And it's against this people, not separating the elite who he's been castigating here, the scribes and the chief priests, etc., from everybody else. But certainly the issue is they're all in this together and are going to go down together, just like in the destruction against Babylon, the ordinary farmers who had nothing to do with the elite's collaboration with Babylon, or with Egypt, with the hope that would save them from Babylon, also suffered in the war and the violence, as it happens nations. And we see that around the world today, how many innocent people are the victims of so many wars and so much imperial violence. And here it's described in great detail. And my note below notes the Hebrew scripture references, and we can see them all laid out here. So they will fall by the edge of the sword, literally the mouth of the sword. And notice when we hear it in its literal, the contrast between the mouth of the sword that destroys and the mouth of Yahweh that's in people to protect them. And that's an image we often see in Revelation, where Jesus is described as attacking them with the sword of his mouth, combining those two images. So we see that here, they'll fall by the mouth of the sword and be taken away. And we see that here in Jeremiah, specifically about anticipating exile there. So in the same kind of context, given into the hands of King Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon, he shall strike them down with the mouth of the sword, just as the Romans are about to do in this context. Taken away as captives from all nations. And again, we see that there. I didn't have a very specific reference. There are others here as prisoners of war. I didn't put those all up. Honestly, I was trying to keep it all on one page. Among captives among all the nations, plainly expressing a new diaspora, just like the original exile, and these people will be scattered around. And as I noted earlier in translations, we looked at a chart around all the nations. I won't bring it up here. Ethnos here is 3 times in this verse. The New RSV, for no reason I can imagine, translated as nations here and Gentiles here. But it's the same word. As I noted in an earlier video, there's really no reason in the 21st century to use the anachronistic term Gentiles when it's being referred to as the nations. So captive among all nations, and Jerusalem will be trampled on by those nations. And we see that here, both in the Daniel context, where he asks how long in this vision concerning the regular burnt offering and the giving over the sanctuary and host to be trampled. And he's given this time that's a special way of saying it in Daniel, 3.5 years, or a time and times and half a time. Here we have it laid out in days of 2,300 evenings and mornings. And the point isn't how much that is. That's half of 7 and a symbolic time period, as here it is a symbolic kairos of the nations are fulfilled. And that's similar to what we see here in Tobit, in the apocryphal text of Tobit, where the speaker here narrates that Jerusalem will be desolate, anticipating the exile, and then also the restoration. Will bring them back into their land, and they will rebuild the house of God and rebuild Jerusalem in splendor. So we see that there. As Vincent notes below, Luke separates more clearly than Mark the end of the temple from the end of time, and inserts a whole new open-ended period, the times of the Gentiles. Although I would suggest against Vincent, if this time is not till the end of time, it's simply to the end of the captivity of Jerusalem, and that there's still plenty of chronos after this kairos. Although we could disagree about that. There's nothing specifically here that's suggesting anything about the end of time, whatever that would actually mean. Here the word fulfilled is pleroo. I noted earlier we've seen it in terms of telos, a completion, but not in terms of eschaton, which is what usually people think of when they talk about the end times. And so Luke is particularly not using that word in this context. Then he moves on to the signs and the sun and the moon and the stars. And notice he doesn't name any. And Vincent again is helpful. He says signs are useless as predictors of the kingdom's near arrival and unnecessary as indicators of its presence. The kingdom is already near, and when it arrives, you'll know, as we've heard in Luke throughout. The issue here is that his audience, they ask for what the sign will be. And interestingly, he doesn't tell them. He just says generically there'll be signs in the moon and the stars. And interestingly, in Mark and Matthew, that becomes the notion of an eclipse, echoing what we see here. So let's look at these passages. First from Deuteronomy, using the sun and the moon and the stars as representatives of foreign gods. And notice that in Deuteronomy, this is not yet a monotheistic situation, it's a henotheistic situation. As we hear in the Ten Commandments, you will have no other gods before you. So in this context, is seeing that the other nations see the sun and the moon as stars, as representatives, or as actually divinities. Here it says, do not be led astray, a word we saw earlier about do not be led astray by false messiahs, planao, meaning specifically not be religiously or theologically led astray and bow down to them. So the sun, the moon, and the stars is representing competing divinities, but plainly for a monotheistic culture, as the post-exilic community was, and certainly as the New Testament community of Jesus followers is, that's not the issue. The issue is God's in control of them, and so we see the threat, and we see it here in Isaiah, but also the exact same thing we find in Ezekiel and in Joel. The stars of the heavens and their constellations will not give their light, the sun will be dark at its rising, and the moon will not shed its light. And we can interpret the sun and the moon not shedding their light as eclipses, and Matthew's scenario of the crucifixion certainly presents it that way. But there's nothing about the stars of the heaven that are constellations not giving their light that suggests an eclipse. This is simply the undoing of creation from Genesis 1, and simply showing that the Creator is in charge. And the fact that people are confused shows they don't recognize that. They don't understand what's going on here. And we notice that the question of the sun and the signs in the sun, the moon, and the stars, and then the distress about the roaring of the sea and the waves is connected in Hebrew Scripture. And certainly a naive reader of Luke would wonder, I don't know what he's talking about. Why would you? But we see that they're connected here. We see in Jeremiah 31:35, Yahweh who gives the sun for light by day and the fixed order of the moon and the stars by light, who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar. And then similarly we see in Isaiah 51, although this is in the Psalm, you silence the roaring of the seas, the roaring of their waves, identical in Isaiah 51 as is in the Psalm. So plainly the issue here isn't trying to figure out what's going on by the roaring of the sea and the waves, and we'll look at those words in a minute. The issue is the confusion. Aporia, only here in the New Testament, as my note has, they won't know either the source or the solution. That's what the issue is they don't understand that these are symbols of God's sovereignty. The word for roaring of the sea and the waves, just referring back to my references there, and similarly here. Curiously, there's not a roaring of the waves, just simply waves. And one would think that the waves are not necessarily unusual, but if we think of this as applying to both, then the waves would be roaring as well, expressing that in Elos. So we see that as we already looked at here by the roaring of the waves. Then it continues. People will faint from fear and foreboding, using another word only here in the New Testament, but echoing as we see from Jeremiah, as you can see right here. Do not be faint-hearted or fearful at the rumors heard in the land. Notice rumors of violence in the land and of ruler against ruler. All similar to what we heard earlier about nation will rise against nation and kingdom against kingdom, although Luke left out the language in Mark about rumors of war. He had wars but left out rumors of war, and he doesn't have rumors here, but plainly this passage is in the background using the unique Septuagint word that's only in the New Testament and there in Jeremiah. So they'll certainly feel faint from fear and foreboding, again, because they don't understand what's happening. They're hearing rumors, and it's making them anxious, and they don't understand that this is God's action that's taking place. But it's described as coming upon the world, the ecumene here, not just Jerusalem. And notice how that links us back intratextually to the devil back here, where we heard the devil led him up and showed him in an instant all the kingdoms of the world, using ecumene there, and said, to you I will give their glory and all this authority, for it has been given over to me. And that's something I've been looking at in this whole apocalyptic section, is the questions, simply the reign of God versus the reign of Caesar, or is it the reign of God versus the reign of the devil? And the apocalyptic context that echoes the kind of world we see in Revelation certainly would be heard that way, that Rome's power, as we hear in the language of John's Gospel, comes from above, which is not to say from God, but from the devil. Certainly Pilate's power comes from Caesar, who's above him in the hierarchy, but ultimately from what John's Gospel calls the evil one. So this is coming upon the whole world there, controlled by Rome, which is, to Luke's audience, certainly more relevance than Jerusalem. That something is happening will not just affect Jerusalem, about which they don't care and has already happened in their world in the past, but about the world that they're a part of. And do they really trust that the God that Jesus proclaims and embodies is more powerful than the Roman Empire and its gods? And of course, that is the faith question. And here's where it comes to roost. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. We see that here in this form, not in the form of shaken, but all the hosts of heaven shall rot away and the skies roll up like a scroll, echoed in Revelation's vision of the seals on the sixth seal, and the host shall wither like a leaf withering on the vine. And so this image of the powers of the heavens, the dunamis here, as a symbol again of the representation between, the correlation rather, between the sky and the earth, between the power of the sky from God or from some other source. In the book of Enoch, we see the source being the rebellious angels, although Luke doesn't take up that issue specifically. And they will be shaken, which is to say their throne and their power will become unstable. And at that moment, then it happens. And this is included in all of them. And they will see the human one coming in a cloud. As I've noted many times, Son of Man is not a good translation. It's really clearly human one. As we saw last time in the intratextual echoes in Luke, so many of the things that we heard in the preceding verses echoed human one confrontation passages. Would you acknowledge the Son of Man before the angels? Or are you ashamed of the Son of Man or the human one before the angels, etc.? So now finally it's happening. The day of the human one being revealed, as we heard earlier in Luke, is finally happening in a cloud with power. And although this has been taken so literally, and as you can see from this quick screen grab from a search on the internet, so many people take it so literally and picture the white Jesus up in the clouds coming. But plainly, this is an image from Daniel 7:13 and 14, one of the most important intertextual echoes in the entire Bible, and certainly in all the four Gospels, presenting Jesus as the one like a human being who replaces the kings who ruled like beasts, as we see in the earlier part of Daniel 7. And to him is given dominion and glory and kingship, that all peoples, nations, and languages should serve him, an everlasting dominion, which is to say, the reign of God. And then we see the last part of this, the power and glory, echoed in this Psalm 32. Look upon your sanctuary, beholding your power and glory in the sanctuary. But this draws us not to look in the Jerusalem temple, which is destroyed, but to look up to the sky. And so this is not meant to be taken literally the way some take it. It's an image of the alternative power in the sky, that the powers in the sky are shaken and another power is sent. The representative of the Creator is sent. So we see the end of Luke with Jesus' ascension and the beginning of Acts when Jesus goes back up to the sky and the voice says to the apostles or disciples on the ground, "Why are you standing here looking up at the sky?" With, I think, was a humorous reference to, don't be taking this so literally. Don't be worried about whether Jesus is somehow just beyond that cloud or just beyond that star. It's a symbol, apocalyptically, of the two different realms of power. And so this unit ends with, after you see all these things, now the time has come to stand up, raise your heads, because your redemption is near. And the stand up echoes the bent over woman standing up there. The raising your head, we saw a raising at least a couple times earlier. And the redemption is only here in the Gospels. Apollotrosis here, but we see it. Actually, it's not in Exodus and Daniel in the same point as it's there, but it's an unrelated element there. But notice how similar, as I was noting last time in the intratextual, this is to what we see in Revelation 18, when Babylon falls and all the saints, prophets, and apostles are celebrating. And so that's the issue here, that when Jerusalem falls, where Jesus' disciples see that as something to lament or something to celebrate, that the destruction of those who have held them captive and kept the poor down and have extracted wealth from the poor to give it to the rich are being destroyed. And one could have asked the same thing about the exile 6 centuries earlier. For the elite who wrote the text, it was the greatest tragedy ever. But we have to wonder whether for the farmers left in the land, whether the exile was a form of jubilee, with their debts released because the temple which kept the records was destroyed, and all those who held their debts taken hundreds of miles away to deal with other things. So whether you see the destruction of the status quo as something to lament or something to celebrate, that God's reign can be revealed in its place, maybe say something about your own faith stance as well as mine. And we'll continue with this parable of the fig tree and all the trees next time. See you then for that. Bye-bye.